Hello and welcome to Maths on the Move, the podcast from plus.maths.org. I'm Marianne Freiberger. How happy would you be to stick your hand into a bowl of used condoms? No matter what your personal answer to this question is, studies have shown that people are happier sticking their hands into a bowl of used condoms if they've just watched an arousing video. And this suggests that sexual arousal may reduce our disgust response. This is one of the very interesting things we found out in one of our favorite podcasts from our archive, called Sexual Statistics. It was originally recorded back in 2015 and features our good friend David Spiegelhalter, who at the time had just published his book Sex by Numbers, which is still available in all good bookstores. In this episode of Maths on the Move, we revisit that podcast, not just because it was fun, but also because it's relevant again. 2023 is a very good year for sex, because this year the 4th National Survey of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyle is being conducted. This is among the largest surveys of sexual behavior in the world and tells us about all sorts of things that go on behind closed doors or maybe even out in the open. Spiegelhalter's aim with the book was not just to talk about sex, but also to get people interested in a critical approach to the numbers they hear about in the news and give them the tools to figure out if they can be believed or not. David is very well placed to do this because he's one of the UK's foremost statisticians and also communicators of all things to do with statistics. We were reminded of this recently when we met him again for the first time in person since the pandemic at an event organised by the Newton Gateway to Mathematics in Cambridge, which was all about communicating mathematics as well as statistics for the public. But now, without further ado, here's David talking about all the weird and wonderful statistics of sex. The true, the not so true, the completely made up, and the disgusting.
So, David, you've written a book about sex.
Yes, I've written this book, Sex by Numbers, available in all good bookshops, and it's a book about statistics. And it actually is a book about statistics and statistical ideas and statistical methods using sex as an example. And of course it's got all sorts of numbers and interesting things. I hope people will think these are great stories. But there's my ulterior purpose, of course, is to get people interested in a critical approach to the numbers that they hear about in the news or elsewhere. Sex is a great topic because we know there's lots going on, but we don't know what goes on or how much. It's all, most of the time anyway, goes on behind closed doors, and people might be quite reluctant, to say what's happening. So it's really a difficult topic to investigate scientifically, but it's necessary, and so it's a real challenge for statistics.
So what aspects of the data to do with sex and sexual attitudes, what kind of interesting statistical ideas come up in that kind of data?
Well, one thing I do in the book is to try to say that not all the numbers we hear about in terms of sexual behaviour or anything are equally valuable. So I give them star ratings, which is quite rough. So 4-star would be numbers we actually believe. So in sex, for example, we might know the number of births, we know pretty well the number of abortions, we know the number of registered sexually transmitted diseases, but of course that's not actually necessarily all the disease that's there, and so on. So sometimes we got some good statistics, and then the next level down, 3-star, are the good surveys. I talk a lot about the British National Survey of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles, which is. They really try hard. They spend a lot of money, a lot of effort to get a random sample of people, to try to get as many people to respond, to try to make sure people answer accurately by ensuring confidentiality. People are interviewed with a computer that they fill up their answers. The interviewer doesn't see any of the responses. It's all closed up, locked, etc. So they do everything they can to try to get accurate answers. And so those are pretty good. They're not great. I would say they're accurate to about 20% or so. 2-star are the ones, now we're getting a little bit ropier, are the ones, for example, people set up internet panels now, which they try to balance the population, but they're still volunteers, and you really don't know whether they're biased towards one way or another. to some extent. So they're not bad. Because then we start getting really bad ones where all the standard websites, click here if you want to answer our sexual questions and things like that. No, it's going to be hopelessly unreliable in terms of the sample of people you've got. I mean, it'll show what some people do, what the readers of this website might do or believe, but it's not going to be representative of a general population. And then 0 stars are ones that people just make up.
What's one that people have just made up?
Oh, there's some lovely historical ones about, I really like these old-fashioned ones, the 18th century, the 19th century ones about the terrible harm of masturbation, and having an orgasm, is the equivalent to losing, so many ounces of blood. So this is encouraging continence in everybody, and the men thinking about sex every 7 seconds and all that kind of thing.
Not true?
No, not true. Interesting, amazing experiments that people have tried to do about how often people do think about sex. So just asking someone is quite tricky. So, but then they give people little clickers to record how often, as they wander around, how often they're thinking about sex, and that varies enormously, among people. And you find out that people think about food more than they think about sex. And then they have tried giving people smartphones and actually phoning them or buzzing them at random times of the day and asking them, are you thinking about sex now? And of course they don't find it's not like anything like 7 seconds. It varies enormously from person to person, but it generally is only going to be a few times a day.
What's one of your favourite stories from the book?
One issue that comes up again and again in surveys of sexual behaviour is that if you ask people how many sexual partners have you had during your lifetime, men admit to claim to have had far more than women do on average. But mathematically, in a closed population of the same number of men and women, the average in terms of the mean number of sexual partners should be the same, opposite sex sexual partners should be the same. And yet, for example, on average, the people surveyed in this survey, the men say they've had 14 sexual partners on average, and the women say 7. Now, there's a lot of things about that average. First of all, it's an average of a distribution which is nowhere near symmetric around that average. In fact, if you ask 35 to 45-year-olds, the most common number of opposite sexual partners they've had is 1, precisely 1. That's the mode of the distribution, is at 1. And then it's got this enormously long tail, out of 500 or something. I guess just goes shooting out like that. But the average of this distribution is different for the men and women. So people are really thinking, why is this the case? Why do men say they've had more sexual partners than women? All sorts of theories have been suggested. So one theory that people have said, this explains it, is that men are going to prostitutes. And so that's where their sexual partners come from. And because prostitutes don't get into the survey, who have had huge numbers of sexual partners, that downweights the average number for women. The people who do the British survey don't think that is such a big influence, but some people claim it is. So another way is to look at just how people answer the question, and the data itself reveals interesting patterns on that, because I said this distribution, if you ask people, they got this distribution with a peak at 1 and a great long tail. Okay, for low numbers, people count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, etc., etc. Then it all starts getting a bit lumpy because people stop being able to count exactly on their fingers or their toes, and they start saying, 15, 20, 25, great lump on 30, 50, etc. People just say making rough estimates. Now, and it's been said also that, men just make these rounded figures, whereas women count them individually. Actually, that's not the case either. Women are giving rounded figures as well. So there's a suggestion that men tend to round up, maybe, and women tend to round down, which I think is probably quite an influence. There's another factor, though, is what people count as a sexual partner. In the surveys, they give a very strict instruction of what counts as a sexual partner. But actually, in practice, women may not count or want to count relationships that they want to forget, for which there was some coercion, and so on. So they actually may not give the same number as men might. And you've always got this thing of social acceptability bias, as it's known. It's just that there's a natural feeling, to some extent, of it being more respectable for men to say they've had lots of sexual partners than it is for women.
Given that Given that gathering data on this kind of topic is so difficult, I mean, what does statistics and probability bring to it to help make the evidence more reliable or to judge the evidence better?
Yeah, I think, well, it can give you an idea of the reliability of the data by making statistical comparisons. So the good surveys check all the time. They check, within a series of questions about consistency, but then they look at consistency across different cohorts of people. So it's interesting, because the big surveys have been done in 1990, 2000 and 2010. For example, in 2000, you can ask 20-year-olds, did you have sex before you were 16? And then in 2010, you ask 30-year-olds, did you have sex before you were 16? And you should get the same answer. They're not the same people, but up to chance, they should get the same answer. You're asking about the same event. Did you? And if there's a difference, you know there's an inconsistency there. Now, it turns out that between 2000 and 2010, you get fairly consistent results between people. But between 1990 and 2000, there seems to be an increase in the willingness to accept, to report behaviour such as having sex early, same-sex experience, masturbation, and so on. So there's so that looks like by doing that, using quite clever statistical tricks, you can work out to some extent the reliability of your data.
What's one of the most surprising facts that people might learn when they read the book?
Yeah. The one, I was amazed by this. Every year the Office of National Statistics reports how many boys and how many girls have been born in this country. And we know it's pretty reliable that there's 105 boys born for every 100 girls. There's always more boys born than girls, just for whatever reasons. That's what happens. But that ratio is known as the sex ratio. And they report it back to 1837 when good, national records started being reported. And if you plot that, I don't think anyone's ever plotted it. If you plot it, you don't just get random variation from year to year, you get a very systematic pattern. And do you know when the absolute peaks are of when more boys are born than at any other time in history? 1919 and 1945.
And what happened at 1919 and 1945?
Wars. More boys are born at the end of wars. It's the same in the US. The peak is in 1946 for the number of boys born. In the US, in 1946 the peak is, and it's repeated after the First World War in various other countries as well. It is actual fact, 4-star, uncontrovertible, that more boys are born at the end of wars.
And why do you think...
why would that be exactly? If people have come up with all sorts of theories of that, all sorts of evolutionary biological theory. There's this Trivers-Willard hypothesis that by some mechanism that females can, to a small extent, control the gender of their offspring as that which is most suitable to the environment. And this has been, people think this has been observed in animals, that high-ranking mates of high-ranking males, dominant males, might have more boys because that's what's suited to their the family. So there's that suggestion that almost somehow boys are needed, so they could be sort of popped out by women. I find this deeply suspicious. I just don't believe it, to be honest. But there's also a finding, a very common finding, that more boys tend to be born to younger women, and particularly increased sexual activity seems to lead to more boys. Now, why would having a lot of sex lead to more boys? Now, and the point is that a lot of sex is fairly, I think, uncontroversial to think that at the end of wars, with soldiers home on leave, particularly soldiers being demobbed and coming home, that there's going to be fairly intense sexual activity. We know that huge numbers of babies are born. More babies were born in 1919 in this country than any other year. So we know there's intense sex at the end of wars. So why would more intense sex lead to more boys? Well, the first thing is that more intense sex leads to babies being conceived at different time of the cycle. There's women have a distribution of fertility throughout the cycle, with a peak around 2 days before ovulation, where a young woman has got at least 50% chance of conceiving from a single act of sex, and maybe a lot higher than that. So, but if you have sex intensely, you're home on leave, you have a lot of sex, then you're more likely to conceive early on in the cycle because you're likely to be pregnant before the peak fertility time. So intense sex leads to conceptions to some extent being having early on in the cycle. And there's another theory that says that babies conceived at different times in the cycle, to a small extent, have different genders. That babies conceived early on in the cycle tend to be boys, for reasons not really well explained, but for it's quite plausible hormonal reasons why that might be the case. Okay, so there's the theory that more intense sex leads to more boys because they are conceived at a different time. Now, the point is that you may argue about that, but it leads to another possible evidence for another great mystery of babies and sex. How did the Victorians stop having babies? In the 1850s, Victorians used to have 5-6 babies each, natural fertility that people still do in some parts of Africa. And they reduced it by the start of the 20th century, people were having 2 babies each. On average, a massive reduction in fertility in this country. Huge change. Without artificial contraception. It wasn't used very much at all. We do know that. There was some condoms being used and some use of sponges and things, but really very little use of artificial contraception. So how did they stop having babies? And historians have argued about this for ages. It turns out that if you plot the sex ratio, the proportion of boys being born dropped steadily throughout that whole period at the end of the Victorian period, reaching an absolute rock bottom around 1898, 1900. Proportionally more girls were born at any other time in history around about 1898, 1900. And this suggests if more boys means more sex, more girls means less sex. So the fact that fewer boys were being born suggests that sexual activity, the intensity of sexual activity, was dropping throughout the entire Victorian period, reaching a rock bottom around about the turn of the century, which reinforces the historian's idea that the reason people didn't have babies is because they weren't having sex. And the idea of abstinence or continence is what was known. Now, that was part of the Victorian culture, really promoted by people. Sex once a month was quite enough, even if that was slightly excessive. So that was actively promoted, that abstinence and continence was just a part of decent human behaviour. But women were choosing this. All this evidence now suggests women were choosing this as a way just to avoid having babies. They didn't have sex.
As well as a great read, what do you hope people will take away from reading this book?
Oh, a number of things. I think the first thing is that when you see a number, think about, can I believe this? And maybe provide some tools for actually checking whether you can believe them or not. So that's my star rating system. I just use a simple way to say some of these numbers are great. I don't believe them. Can we just sort of, do we know how it's constructed, how it's arrived at? Is it plausible? Just think about it. Is this number plausible? So don't read it. I don't think people do believe all the numbers they hear, particularly not on sex. I mean, you just Google, 10 sex statistics, and you find out all this drivel comes out. But some of them are good, some of them are right. And I cover all sorts of stuff about, behaviour and, length of time people have sex for and all that sort of stuff. And some of this data, actually, though, is rather good. So the other thing I want people to realise is that you actually can get some decent data in really tricky areas by, first of all, by doing questionnaires on people, and interviewing them in a really, putting a lot of effort into it, very expensive, but also by doing experiments, extraordinary experiments that people do, randomised experiments where you take groups of people and you randomly allocate them to different interventions, and then to see, what the effect is. So, for example, there's a lovely one on the partnership one, where they took, most of these, of course, are psychology students, usually American psychology students, unfortunately, but that's who they've got access to. So they took groups of people and randomly allocated them to fill up a sex questionnaire on including how many partners have they had. But one group of people, were guaranteed confidentiality. Another group of people thought that their questionnaire could be read by one of their colleagues, because after they filled it in, they knew that one of their colleagues was just going to come and pick it up and walk out the door with it and could easily read it. And another group were wired up to this machine with all wiggly lines and told it was a lie detector, because it wasn't. They're completely spurious. It's called a bogus pipeline experiment. They do lots of these fake lie detectors. And what do they find? That the people wired up to the lie detector admitted to having more sexual partners, and the people who thought their questionnaire might be read, the women admitted to having fewer.
So for women, if they think they're going to be the answers might be seen, they'll put down
they're
less.
Lower, yes. Not so evident in men, but in women that was definitely the case. So that's a nice experiment. The other extraordinary experiments are things like working out about... it's a bit of a mystery, the sort of things people get up to, in sex are not things they would normally think of doing. All this connection with another person, all this sort of body parts and liquids and things like that. So there's a basic idea that maybe sexual arousal reduces your disgust response. In other words, you're willing to do more if you're sexually aroused, you're actually willing to do some things you wouldn't normally want to do. So great experiment. So they randomly allocate people to watch different sorts of videos. One is sexually arousing video, a bit of soft porn. There's men and women. Sexual. One is a very neutral video, which is a train journey. I think I'd find that rather arousing myself. And another one is watching. No, I can't remember what the third intervention was. Anyway, so these different types of videos. And then they get them ask them to do various disgusting things. Sticking a pin into a cow's eyeball, handling used tissues, handling used panties, which actually were stained with something else, and putting their hand into a bowl of apparently used condoms, which hadn't been, but they had been smeared with this stuff. The investigators had this vivid imagination of these disgusting things. And what do? They found out that the people who had just seen the arousing film were more willing to do these apparently disgusting tasks.
That's a lovely note to end on, I think. David, thank you so much for talking to us about your book, and we look forward to hearing more.
That was David Spiegelhalter talking to my colleague Rachel Thomas back in 2015 about sex and statistics. That's it for this episode of Maths on the Move, the podcast from plus.maths.org. If you would like to find out more about sexualist statistics, visit plus.maths.org and search sexual statistics. And if you'd like to find out more about some of the amazing work that David Spiegelhalter has done, search for David Spiegelhalter. Thanks for listening and bye-bye.